1818, when the estate passed to William Coombe, who announced his intention to enclose a large area of farming land and convert it to pasture for his cattle. This wasn't as straightforward as you might imagine. The land formed part of the town's commons, where since time immemorial, local people had enjoyed commoners' rights, that is, the right to farm strips of communal land in return for a payment of a tithe, 1/10 of their produce, or the equivalent in money to the landowner. To the average villager, enclosure meant that some grasping landlord was taking food out of their mouths by turning into pasture the little strips of communal farmland that had always been theirs to rent. In Warwickshire, any proposal to enclose common land aroused almost hysterical opposition. Just 7 years earlier, there had been a crusade of 3,000 men, women and children who rampaged through the county, destroying whatever enclosures they could find, filling ditches and cutting down the hedges. The second complication for William Coombe was that much of the land he wanted to enclose was leased, and those who owned the leases stood to lose the annual tithes paid by the tenant farmers. The major leaseholders were William Shakespeare and Stratford Corporation, and in order to avoid their opposition, Coombe offered to reimburse them for the loss of the tithes. Shakespeare appears to have been satisfied with this arrangement. The council thought otherwise. At a general meeting on the 23rd of December, they drafted letters to Shakespeare and William Coombe listing the tragedy that would result if the enclosure was successful. Stratford has to support 700 poor out of the income from the tithes, and will be utterly ruined unless Christian meditations cause the recipient of this letter to change his mind. There were no changes of mind, and the dispute escalated. At a stormy meeting, one council member spoke forcefully for many townsfolk. "We will be traitors to our unborn children if we permit this betrayal of the town. Not even the 3 fires that have ravaged Stratford in the past 20 years will be as destructive as the plan to enclose the common fields at Welcome." When a Stratford delegation went to Welcome, they were told they were curs and ordered to leave. William Coombe was now in a fury and decided to implement his scheme regardless of the opposition. He began to enclose the disputed land with ditches, but when the townsfolk found out, they stormed in a mob to Welcome and filled in the ditches as Coombe harangued them as Puritan knaves. When the townspeople learned that Coombe was recruiting his own militia to protect his land, they were enraged, and the dispute threatened to become violent. Calmer heads, though, proposed a different strategy. By a narrow margin, the council voted to use town revenues to fight William Coombe in the courts. Eventually, the Privy Council in London decreed that Coombe must pay a heavy fine and put the land back as it was. This proved a final triumph for medievalism. But even the most determined town council couldn't banish the principles of modern farming forever. Within a century, the legal enclosure of common land began to transform the countryside forever, although, as we've already seen, many old country traditions have survived the passing of time. Maypole dancing and other long-established folk dances have shed their associations with paganism and are now considered a rather quaint, if rather eccentric, part of Old English custom. All